Good morning. My name is Ertharin, and I'm a distinguished fellow of global food and agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all, and especially our members, for joining us via Zoom for today's On the Record program. If you'd like to submit a question to today's panel, please visit ccga.live. As a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. As a primarily international think tank, the Council is convening today's discussion because criminal justice reform and the related important domestic issues, particularly given the long history of racial tension and injustice in America, diametrically conflict with commitments our nation has made to supporting a more just and equal world. We strengthen our foreign policy and our international engagements when we lead by example, as the US assists other countries in their pursuit of human rights and freedom for their own countries. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker for this important dialogue. First, let's begin with Brittany Barnett. Brittany is an award-winning attorney and entrepreneur focused on social impact investing. She is the founder of several nonprofits and social enterprises, including the Buried Alive Project, Girls Embracing Mothers, 26 Capital Partners, and Millennia Reign LLC. She is the author of a new book, A Knock at Midnight, a story of hope and justice and freedom. This book is available for sale through our partner, the bookseller. We're also joined by Janice Mathis. Janice is the executive director of the NCNW, the National Council on Negro Women, an organization committed to leading, advocating for, and empowering women of African descent, their families, and communities. Among her many accomplishments, Janice testified before the US Sentencing Commission on the crack powder cocaine disparity, and she testified before the United Nations Commission to End Racial Discrimination in Geneva, Switzerland. And finally, we're joined by Louis Reed, who serves as the Director of Organizing and Partnership for #Cut50. He is also a board-certified addictions counselor and licensed alcohol and addictions practitioner. Prior to joining #Cut50, he was the Connecticut policy strategist for the Cattell Center for Health, Equity, and Justice, where he worked on SB 13 and ran his own addiction and mental health practice, serving clients across Southern Connecticut. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. Let's begin. Despite the United States constituting about 5% of the world's population, we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. And while Black and Latino Americans make up 30% of the US population, they account for 60% of our prisoners. Some may argue that when you commit the crime, you must do the time, while others point to these incarceration numbers as an example of systemic racism. What evidence do we have to support the actual reasons for this disproportionate incarceration rate? Let's start with you, with Louis.
Typically, I was raised by my grandmama, and usually when I'm in a room full of women, I typically defer to the women first. But since you tossed it to me, I'll take a stab at it. Well, first and foremost, I just want to appreciate your leadership on this very important subject today. As someone who served nearly 14 years in federal prison, the issue of mass incarceration, specifically as it relates to Black, brown, and poor white folks in the United States of America, is something that I am absolutely connected to. When I was incarcerated, I saw genius. I saw people who had just the most precocious minds that you could ever come across. I saw people who were not prisoners, who were not inmates, who were not convicts, but I saw mothers, I saw fathers, I saw brothers, I saw sisters. I saw people who demonstrated the hope and the potential of what America is, in theory, has been constructed on. And so when I look at why things are as proportionate as they are, quite frankly, it's, from my opinion, it's a matter of poverty. And when we say, when we think about the war on drugs, and when we say that we have to lock people up and we have to be hard on crime, and if you do the crime, you have to do the time, in essence, what that was translated to mean was that there was an open declaration of Black, brown, and poor white people that needed to be prosecuted if they came from disenfranchised areas, if they came from areas of poverty. And as a result of such, that is what we saw as a exponential boom in terms of the mass industrial prison complex. And so, in short, all of that to say, in short, those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, but furthest from resources and power. And so when you have people who appear in a courtroom without adequate representation, they don't necessarily have the legal sophistication of a Brittany Barnett to represent them, as passionately as someone would. When they don't have adequate representation, when there is an ignorance to the law, and when they don't have access to resources, power, influence, and affluence, quite frankly, the sum total of what you are going to get is an excessive prosecution and a disproportionate sentence. And unfortunately, that happens to fall on the backs of people who look like myself.
So, Louis, we went to you as the the only man on the panel, and so I thought I'd go to you first, because as I turn to Brittany as an attorney, and listening to Louis talk about the lack of access to resources and the impact of poverty as driving factors for mass incarceration. As an attorney, you've been in courtrooms and you've written about this, as well as advocated around these issues. How do you see these challenges and the driving factors for the number of Black and Latinx inmates in our institutions today?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what my brother Louis was saying. I am an attorney on the front lines doing this work, but I'm also the daughter of a formerly incarcerated mother. And so I approach these issues from a perspective of being able to combine my lived experience with my legal experience. And that's always how I approach the work. It is beyond legitimate debate at this point that our nation's legal system bleeds with racial inequity. Mm-hmm. And the way that perpetuates itself and looks in real life is where you have in the federal system today, where all of my work is focused, over 80% of the people in federal prison for drugs are Black and brown. So the proof is in the pudding. Numbers speak, the data speaks. And so the work that I do is I try to merge those stats and stories in a way that humanizes the issue that is undeniable at this point.
And that undeniability, as you've just spoken to it so eloquently, Brittany, I want to turn to you, Janice. You have a long and personal professional history of working to address criminal justice reform. And now, following in the footsteps of Dr. Hyde as leader of NCNW, you've become a vocal national advocate for criminal justice reform, as well as for other issues affecting Black women and families, as have Brittany and Lewis have just been so eloquently addressing. And although our focus today is on U.S. criminal justice reform, are there any strategies that look beyond U.S. borders to forging solutions to the issues of mass incarceration? And how does the world's opinion affect U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policy around these issues, if at all? And is the UN an avenue to raise domestic justice concerns? Janice, we can't hear you. You're muted. I'm sorry.
Terrible habit that I have of not unmuting. I just said, first I want to thank you and the council for this timely and important discussion, and for including NCNW in the discussion. You ask an important question about whether there are strategies beyond U.S. borders. And you mentioned in the very generous introduction that I had actually testified at one point before the Commission to eliminate racial discrimination. And what struck me about that encounter was wonderful. Going to Geneva is wonderful. But what was not so wonderful about it is the U.S. delegation to that convening was very homogenous. And I was one of the very few people of color to be part of, I wasn't part of the official U.S. delegation, but to be present as an American. And that was telling and disappointing. The United Nations has an office on drugs and crime, as they have offices on many aspects. And one of them, we think about police power. What is the fundamental mission of policing? It is to protect people, their liberty, their rights. But in some environments, and we think about global, you've been involved in a lot of post-conflict situations. We think about coups and revolutions, but right here in our own country, often police power is used to impede human rights, to exacerbate the political and socioeconomic issues that we face, the racial issues. But I must say that over these last 3 decades, and I credit movements like Black Lives Matter and the activism of young folk who won't take no for an answer, and certainly books like Michelle's book on mass incarceration. There's been a change even among the most conservative. I remember in Georgia, we had a Republican-controlled legislature, and the year that the budget for criminal justice exceeded the budget for education was sort of a tipping point. When the GOP leaders of the state realized that they were spending over $1 billion on incarceration and about $800,000 on education, it started to make sense. So we're really getting the bang for our buck. But to get back to your question, yes, I think there is an avenue before offices like the Office on Drugs and Crime where we can make the case that this is a human rights violation. And while the United States might not be in open armed conflict, we certainly are at a tipping point. I hear people talk about a reckoning on race. I hope to God we are at a reckoning on race, because maybe it will finally get us to understand that we should do better, because where communities are engaged and where they have an opportunity to be consulted on delivery of police services, there are benefits. Strengthening public confidence, and God knows we could use a little strengthening of public confidence right now. Strengthening the belief in democracy, and that leads to improved compliance. So I think there is a role. I mean, if you go all the way back to the Civil War, the Confederacy and the United States were both concerned about what Europe would think about the conflict. In the 60s, one of the driving forces behind the Voting Rights Act and the reaction to that was, what is the world thinking of the United States? And here we are at another tipping point where world opinion of the United States is mixed at best. So I think it gives us an opportunity to express ourselves. Go to New York and let's make some noise.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Go to New York and let's make some noise. Too often, and as you note in these forums, the issues that directly affect people of color in the United States are not presented by representative individuals in the conversations. And so the issues related not just to who is incarcerated, but the budgets, as you note, the budget for education was exceeded by the budget for prisons and incarceration. And the effect that that has, not just on who is incarcerated, but on recidivism. And so, Louis, let me come back to you. According to 2019 U.S. Sentencing Commission report on recidivism among federal prisoners, 64% of prisoners convicted of violent offenses were arrested again within 8 years. This statistic is only a piece of a larger problem in which the data suggests reentry, transition programs do not sustain enough support for recently released prisoners. A problem compounded by conditions, as you've addressed before, of poverty, housing, food insecurity, lack of education, the list goes on. With this in mind, can you tell us more about the work you've done to strengthen reentry programs, policy reforms, and the support released prisoners that have supported recently released prisoners, and how the work of #Cut50 more effectively and successfully assists former felons?
That is a very long question. I'll definitely try to address it though. So before I get into that, I just want to touch base on something that Ms. Janice said. She talked about America having a reckoning, or the notion that America is at this crossroads of a reckoning. And I just want to add that before we can get to a reckoning, there has to be repentance. And when we're talking about repentance, essentially that means that people have to admit, people have to accept responsibility, and people have to be wanting accountability for the things that they have done that may have disproportionately impacted folks, specifically within the framework of the conversation that we're talking about. What I did specifically as it relates to the question around reentry is as follows. When I was incarcerated, I happened to have the benefit of being in the singular institution in the entire United States of America that offered the education prerequisites for people to become a addictions practitioner. And so that program was funded in a large part by a grant and an endowment by a community fund in upstate New York, Raybrook, where I did nearly 14 years in federal prison. And what I realized as a result of that was that we incarcerate more than we educate, number one. Number two, we are creating trapdoors to failures rather than springboards to successes. Let me say that again, in the event if my internet happened to be buffering. In the United States of America, we create more trapdoors to failure than we create springboards to successes, particularly for people who are not formally incarcerated. We're talking about people who are felony disenfranchised. You have a high number of people who have never seen the inside of a 6x9 cell. However, they come out of court, they are sentenced to a term of supervision, and they still suffer the more than 46,000 collateral consequences of one singular felony, which means that they can't vote in many states, which means that they can't get life insurance in some states, which means that they are locked out of employment opportunities, they're locked out of housing opportunities ad infinitum. And so when I was released from incarceration, I looked at the issue and I said to myself, how can I add value to this area that we call reentry? So I approached the largest city in Connecticut, Bridgeport, where I'm from. And at the time, it just so happened that the mayor happened to be running for re-election. Now, the backstory on the mayor at that time was that he had served nearly 8.5 years of federal incarceration after having been elected to the mayorship for 4 terms. He was running for a re-opportunity. So I capitalized off the moment, I maximized the moment, and I approached the city after he was elected, and I gave them a proposition to have a government-based office for reentry affairs. And essentially what that meant was, and what that looked like, was that there would be, conceptually, there would be a government-based office for reentry affairs that would be able to bring all of the nonprofits in the city of Bridgeport together. And so not only did they accept that proposal, but they also inaugurated me to be the reentry director. We were so successful in that model for approximately 2 years that we replicated the model not only in 4 other jurisdictions throughout the state of Connecticut, but we also replicated that model in 5 other states as well. And oh, by the way, we won Best Reentry Practices by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. The reason why I bring that up as a background is because as I was doing my professional 2-step at the time, the rug was pulled under me. And the reason being is because I was rearrested in part for child support arrears that accrued while I was incarcerated. So when you look at a statistic, and that statistic says this amount of people that have been released after doing X amount of time that committed this offense falls into this category, oftentimes we don't look at the backstory about what drove those people to be reincarcerated. Could it have been child support arrears that accrued while people were incarcerated, such as myself? Could it be incidental contact with police officers because an individual didn't have an identification card? Could it have been an individual got stopped for a minor a motor vehicle infraction, and as a result of having police contact, that was a violation of his or her probation? So I'm one of those individuals where we have to humanize the stories behind the statistics. And last but not least, I also want to say this as well. We need to do away with this notion in terms of violent offenders versus nonviolent offenders. People are very complex human beings, and they don't fall in these dichotomized categories. Yes, we have people who commit more serious offenses and less serious offenses, but the fact of the matter is that we are never going to be as far as we can be in our conversation around reimagining what criminal justice reform looks like if we don't humanize the people who have these experiences.
Very powerful, Louis. Thank you. And Brittany, let me come back over to you, because you've helped secure the freedom of dozens of men and women serving life sentences through your Buried Alive program. But as we've just heard from Louis, there are more trapdoors to failure than springboards to successes. And so in addition to litigation, the evidence suggests there's more reform that is required, including policing, review, and modification of criminal codes and sentencing guidelines. What steps have you and your organization taken in order to address some of these structural and systemic issues, and what barriers to change exist beyond the obvious issue of political will?
Yeah, so I was consulted by various policy organizations with the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 under President Obama, the First Step Act of 2018 that was signed by President Trump. A lot of the organizations who were pushing for policy change would reach out to the Buried Alive Project and myself for those human stories to help put heartbeats behind the numbers. And so as part of our strategy with both of those bills, we were really pushing for retroactivity to ensure that everyone who was impacted by these unjust laws was able to benefit. And so we had things, for example, the Buried Alive Project and the Incarceration Collective teamed up for the Third Strike campaign, where we were advocating for a change in the law as it related to the 3 strikes and you're out. In the federal system, the 3 strikes law, your 3rd drug felony is a mandatory life without parole in federal prison. Now, the First Step Act changed that law, and now it's a mandatory 25 years, which is still a long time. However, your 2 drug priors have to be serious drug felonies, which constitutes having to have gone to prison for a year or more, and the felony had to have occurred within the past 15 years. However, unfortunately, that piece of the First Step Act was not made retroactive, which means we have people serving life sentences today under yesterday's drug laws. It makes no sense to me. If the law is wrong today, it was wrong yesterday. And so the work that we do works to help make sure that we're keeping retroactivity at the center of these laws that are being changed, but also that we're keeping the people at the forefront, right? Because to me, systemic change doesn't always have to come from Capitol Hill. The people that we are freeing is creating a movement of people and a movement of power and dignity that this nation needs to thrive, who will make systemic change in their communities and so on and so forth. And so I think we have to take a multidimensional approach to what systemic change looks like as we reimagine justice, as Lewis just mentioned, you know, and to know that there are more than one ways to skin a cat, for example. The barriers to change that are there, to me, is this lack of desire and will to center the human element. People are the most important part of it to me. And so we have to ensure that we're centering people who have been directly impacted by this criminal legal system. And I do that through my work in multiple ways. As a social entrepreneur, I co-founded the Buried Alive Project with two of my clients who were serving life without parole and granted clemency by President Obama, Sharonda Jones and Corey Jacobs. I have another nonprofit, Girls Embracing Mothers, as you mentioned, for girls whose moms are incarcerated. And that stemmed from my own experience of having an incarcerated mother. Our program director is a formerly incarcerated woman who was actually in our program a few years ago with her daughter. And so I also work to not just help provide systemic change for people that are in the system as it relates to criminal justice, but also what are we freeing them into? As Lewis just mentioned, you know, so I am holding this vision now of creating systemic liberation, sustainable liberation, and doing that by providing economic capital and resources for people to bridge that gap. As Lewis mentioned, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solutions, but furthest away from the power and resources, as Lewis just said. So I'm working to help bridge that gap, to help people who I've seen are among the untapped genius of this country, to be able to tap into their entrepreneurial spirits to help flourish. And all of this creates systemic change.
And Ms. Cousins, if I just want to correct you on one thing real quick. Brittany has not freed dozens of people. She's freed scores of people. So let the record reflect that this woman is absolutely super, super, super dope.
Thank you, brother.
I'm just meeting her, but I'm feeling that super dope. Okay. Janice, when we think about the laws that are necessary to address the systemic issues that are so well articulated by Lewis and Brittany, the U.S. House passed the Justice in the Policing Act. Do you think that legislation will be reintroduced in the 117th Congress? And is there any possibility of passage? And even more importantly, as I listen to leaders like Brittany and Lewis, as someone who is leading a national organization, a historic institution in our community, how can advocacy groups work more closely and consistently together to ensure the level of change that is required to make a difference?
What a great question. I must congratulate Lewis and Brittany for the work they are doing. And I've got a little bit of a question for Brittany, talking about retro, and I'm gonna get to your question in just a quick second, but talking about retroactivity. Now the big thing in the news, one of the big issues in the news, we're gonna decriminalize marijuana. We've reached the point where marijuana is no longer the danger. What about all the brothers and sisters who are right now incarcerated in state and some in federal institutions for dealing marijuana? And now all of a sudden, it's something you get a prescription for and you go to the ABC. So I was out in Los Angeles and they got a store and the police are there and they check your driver's license. You pick out the brand you want, just like buying a bottle of wine. And I said, what about all the folk who are locked up for seeing this ahead of time, for being visionaries in this space? But let me go back to your question, which was, remind me, Ertharin, what was the question you asked me? Oh, about the
It was about the Justice and Policing Act and
Justice and Policing Act.
More closely.
Well, I want to say to people who live in Georgia or who have family in Georgia, today is the last day to register for the January the 5th runoff. So if you want to do something very concrete to help the Senate pass the reintroduced Justice and Policing Act, vote on January the 5th so that there's a change in the philosophy of the United States Senate, because Justice and Policing Act, as you know, passed the House but could not get a hearing in the Senate. So we need better and new leadership on that front. The other thing that we can do absolutely is to keep the issue on the front burner. You know, after we watched George Floyd's execution, it reminded me of after Sandy Hook. I said, surely now that children have been slaughtered, we will do something about gun reform. I saw George Floyd die on screen live. Surely now we will do something. But the life of the law has really not been logic. It's been the felt necessities of the time. So it's up to us to make the necessities felt, up to us to keep the issue on the front burner. And there's so many things that can be done. The other mistake we make sometimes is we put the police, that's why I'm so glad to hear Lewis and Brittany's point of view, because it's systemic. We put the focus on police misconduct. But really, in our system of justice, the police are kind of like the security guards, and I don't mean to demean them, but they only carry out the orders of the judges and the prosecutors and the legislators. We send them out in uniforms with badges and guns to be the enforcement mechanism. But most of the time, they're not creating the policy. We've got to go after the policy makers who are inside the building, safe and sound.
And as organizations, how do we work better together? And I'll ask you all to address that, because I think that is so important. There's so much good work happening out here, but we need to scale it up. But before we do that, Brittany, you can answer that a bit, but I'd like you to go back to Janice's question directly to you about those who are incarcerated on laws that were, as you said so eloquently before, yesterday's laws, and yet they're still incarcerated today.
Yes, absolutely. Janice brings up an amazing point that we work to ensure all the time, you know, especially as we have more talks about cannabis legalization, you know, and understanding that legalization has to go further to the cannabis justice, right? It's not just always about the legislation, but how is equity being brought to these devastated communities. And seeing the excitement from last week on the bill that passed the House about decriminalizing marijuana, it got me excited too, but it also brings to the forefront that we have to ensure this type of legislation is retroactive. Mm-hmm. You know, if the law, as I mentioned, if the law is wrong today, it was wrong yesterday. Why is this not a normal part of the conversation? I have clients who are set to die in prison, clients serving life without parole for marijuana. Like my client, Farrell Scott from Dallas. And as he says, people are selling cannabis today and getting a life savings. I sold cannabis and I got a life sentence. Mm-hmm. And we have to ensure that we're keeping people like Farrell at the center of these discussions as we move forward to have this conversation and these concrete actions taken to decriminalize cannabis or even to legalize it. It was on the ballot in 5 different states in the election last month and passed with sweeping numbers in 5 different states, including Mississippi. Medicinal use of cannabis is now legal in Mississippi. And so we have to just ensure that we're reaching back to those that were part of the legacy market, as I call it, not the black market, but the legacy market, because they set the blueprint for what's happening today. We have to ensure that justice is brought to them and that there's economic equity in the cannabis space.
And that economic equity, while it is the laws, it begins with the police and who gets arrested. And one of the questions from one of our viewers, Lewis, asks, could you speak to the defund the police movement and dispel any common misunderstandings of the movement? Also speak to how you view its potential to address mass incarcerations and other systemic issues within policing in America.
Well, the 44th president, Barack Obama, recently came under fire because he was saying that how, in essence, you can't legislate through sound bites in terms of defunding the police, and how it doesn't necessarily create productivity, but in essence, it could create problems. And I definitely understand the notion that he was saying. And when you translate, outside of the 5-second soundbite that was extrapolated and got everybody up in arms, essentially what he was saying is this: we expect too much from our men and women who serve in uniform. We expect them to show up to be the licensed marriage and family therapist. We want them to be the reverend. We want them to be the social worker. We want them to be the babysitter. We want them to be all things, everything other than the oath that they have sworn to protect and serve our community. And essentially, when I'm thinking about defunding the police, what that means to me is that we need to divert resources so that they can adequately serve our community. What does that look like? When they are responding to calls that very well may be mental health related, why can't it be that we have a social worker that is going to accompany them on those calls? Why are we trying to arrest our way out of issues and have this quick fix solution, in essence, that is, quite frankly, a problem to our mass incarceration system? They are contributing to it. And the reason why they are contributing to it, just like how Brittany identified, is because there is legislation that allows them to do so. And like Ms. Janice talked about, in my mind, police officers are the sentries to our criminal justice system. They literally have the key that unlocks and or locks people in or out of our mass incarceration system. So when we're talking about defunding the police, we are talking about diverting resources so that they can focus on the main thing, so that they can keep the main thing, and that is protecting and serving. Do police in America need to be demilitarized? Absolutely. I grew up in a time where you had community policing. Essentially, when you got caught in a stolen car, rather than arresting you and perpetuating that school to prison pipeline when you were about 11, 12 years old, essentially what the officer did was bring you home to your parents. And at that time, I was raised by my grandmama, and I begged a cop one time, please bring me to jail. Don't bring me home to my grandmama, because I knew there was going to be repercussions and consequences for me to pay. So I think that, we need to demilitarize our police. We need to hold our police responsible to the office that they have sworn, to the oath that they have sworn to uphold. We need to ensure that they have the appropriate resources that they need so that they can keep the main thing. And also, look, we need to make sure that officers, if they are terminated under a cloud of suspicion, if they do resign under a cloud of suspicion, that they can't pop up a year from now within another municipality, shining a newer badge and wearing a more creased uniform. Look, if there's a doctor who is accused of legal malpractice, and that person has due process, and that person is stripped of his or her license. If someone like Brittany is disbarred in the state of Texas and or wherever that person is barred into, they can't pop up somewhere else and practice law. They can't pop up somewhere else and perform a surgery. Why is it that there's an exception when it comes to people who are supposed to be on the front lines of protecting our communities and serving our communities? So in my mind, when I'm thinking about defunding the police, it actually encapsulates all of those things and more.
Fantastic answer. And unfortunately, that's going to need to be the end of our conversation today. This time was too short for this important dialogue, and your answers were amazing. I'm sure we're going to see feedback from many from the presentations that you've made. So I need to close this out by asking everyone to support the council, to provide you with these types of important dialogues more often. We need you to join the council by purchasing a membership. Membership starts at $100 and allows you entry to not only programs like this one, but many across a broad array of subjects. So go to www.thechicagocouncil.org to donate and to make your contribution today. And thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I want to remind you that copies of Brittany Bennett's book, A Knock at Midnight, A Story of Hope, Justice, and Freedom, are available to purchase by the bookseller at this link, www.booksellers.com. And thank you again for joining us. And I look forward to hosting more conversations for the council. And I want to say to our panelists, you are leading on an issue that affects so many in our community. And on behalf of those who are listening to you today, thank you.